Right then, for the next half an hour or so, we're going to get the story behind the headlines of these business stories, not just today, but in the first half of the year. Joined in the studio by a special guest this morning, John Defterios. John, good morning.
Thank you, Richard.
Nice
to see you.
To me, you need no introduction because I grew up watching you on CNN, but I'm going to give you one anyway. Former anchor at CNN, currently visiting professor of business at NYU Abu Dhabi, senior fellow at the World Economic Forum in Energy and Materials. So, John knows his beans. Given your World Economic Forum fellowship and the energy focus, you've lived in Abu Dhabi, Dubai for many years as well, you follow this industry. Can we start with that IEA story overnight? The report from the International Energy Agency saying the world is facing a, quote, staggering oil surplus by the end of this decade. America and the Middle East pumping just too much oil as demand falls as we all go green. This is Fatih Birol, a man you know well, the head of the International Energy Agency, explaining why the weakness in demand.
What are the key drivers of the slowdown of the global oil demand growth? I see three major drivers. The first one is on the transportation sector. The major penetration of the electric cars in China, in Europe, US, and more in the emerging countries is a key driver.
Discuss.
Well, it's very interesting. It's very controversial, which we can get into here. He's correct, and I have a lot of respect for Fatih Birol. I've interviewed him many times. We're going to see demand in the OECD countries drop from 49 million barrels a day to 43 million barrels a day by 2030. That's the story for the developed economies. But I think the IEA has underestimated the demand's going to come from the global south. So if you look at the projections to try to get to net zero and this goal for the globe to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees centigrade, in the IEA projections, and this is what raised some flags, they don't show any growth from Africa in terms of demand or Latin America or Southeast Asia. I travel the world still in the energy space, both in the hydrocarbons and the renewable sector. That's just not reality. The global growth is coming from the global south. So he's saying that we're going to cap demand at 106 million barrels a day. If you look at the OPEC expectations going to 2040 to 2045, they still see demand holding at about 100 million barrels a day because they see the global demand from the global south still rising, Richard. And in fact, it was so controversial, and I thought this was interesting in March, we had the head of the Energy and Resources Committees from the House and the Senate write a letter to the IEA saying that your projections have been off. So you're trying to encourage an energy transition, but so far, OPEC's research has been more accurate on demand. And even Shell put out a report in the first half of the year saying that LNG demand for natural gas is going to grow 50% to 2040. It's a cleaner fuel. But again, that demand is going to come from other parts, the developing world, the emerging markets of the world, which is a point of focus here for the UAE to try to tap into that growth.
So where does the UAE fit into all this? Sultan Al Jaber, again, someone you know well, has got a foot in both camps, green and hydrocarbons. Day job, CEO of ADNOC, Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, as we always knew it. But he was also the president of COP28 and is a big advocate of renewable energies. Masdar City is where he cut his teeth. Let's hear from Sultan Al Jaber now. This is him speaking recently on the need for green energy.
We need to massively scale up clean energies by 2030, triple renewable capacity to 11,000 gigawatt, and double hydrogen production to 180 million tons.
Seems like the UAE is backing both camps. Can you do that?
Fantastic question, by the way. You know the strategy here is to boost capacity to 5 million barrels a day. They're already at above 4 million barrels a day. I think the strategy here is they realize that demand will tail off after 2040. So the idea is to produce as much oil as you can in this next 2 decades, which is crucial. And I think it's a wise strategy. What Dr. Sultan has said, and I have the honor to chair ADIPEC every year, is that we want to do it as cleanly as possible. So they're front-loading the production now because they see the energy transition coming. Now, in the COP28, he was very instrumental in getting the language here as an orderly transition out of hydrocarbons, which was very controversial with the other Gulf producers, particularly in Saudi Arabia. but it did mark a big pivot point in the energy transition coming forward. But we're trying to triple your renewable energy capacity by 2030. It's probably not doable, but it was very positive that we crossed $2 trillion in terms of investments into renewables in 2023 for the first time. But the International Renewable Energy Agency in Abu Dhabi is saying you need to have $4.3 trillion a year for the next 20 years to be able to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees. We've already surpassed it, but can we come back down by introducing more renewable capacity going forward? So far, these are kind of dreamland figures because we're just not there yet. But it's coming. It's just slower than expected.
From energy to artificial intelligence, Tom, you've got a bell or something, haven't you, every time someone mentions AI?
I have, yeah. So
I think you guys have too much fun in the morning, by the way. I still listen to you when I'm in London, so it's good stuff.
It's nice.
You should have, that bell would have been ringing all the time, Tom, if you were in Davos in 2024, because the whole promenade was every sign on every shop had AI on it. There you go. Just keep it ringing for the next 10 minutes.
Well, let's talk about Davos, because we're going to hear now from Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft. This is him speaking in Davos in January this year. You were there, snow-capped peaks of the Swiss ski resort, talking about AI and the UAE's role in it.
The UAE has rolled out a personalized tutor for every student in the country. In fact, I think Bill first talked about information at your fingertips at Comdex in '93. And this is more about intelligence at your fingertips or expertise at your fingertips. Think about it. You have now technology like something like GPT-4 that essentially can be used to create a personal tutor for every student in the world, right? It's absolutely economically feasible, even with just the government spending that's happening even in the global south, right? So it's not just in the UAE, but it can happen everywhere.
And you've picked up on the fact that Microsoft, his company, bought a $1.5 billion stake in Abu Dhabi's G42.
Good. That's both laced with business practices, which is really wise because they know how important AI is, ring the bell, because they see this as a key pillar of future growth for the UAE. You have to give the CEO of Microsoft incredible kudos because he got them into cloud in a very rapid way, and he's ahead of the curve on AI. NVIDIA crossing $3 trillion in terms of market cap and going for a stock split. So they're good harbingers for the future. I think the market's gotten ahead of that as it often happens. So you see the valuations at a very high peak right now. I saw an interview with His Excellency Omar Olama, the Minister of AI, this week, and he was pointing to the fact that they have been working in this space since 2017. And I think where the advantage for the UAE is, as you well know, for the last 3 decades, they built incredible infrastructure to attract capital into the financial sector, fintech, which is very strong here. They see AI as a next extension of diversification. And if you look at non-oil GDP in the UAE now, and the figure was just recently updated, it's 70%.
10 seconds, final thought on this one, John.
On AI itself?
On AI, yeah.
I think the hype is incredible. I think the other story that often gets overlooked is the threat of cybersecurity and the impact quantum computing and AI will have on our cybersecurity systems.
Our guest this morning is John Defterios, for decades the face of CNN as one of their anchors and emerging market editor, currently visiting professor of business at NYU Abu Dhabi and senior fellow at the World Economic Forum. John, thanks for sticking around.
My pleasure.
Let's turn our attention to elections now. We've just had India. Modi survived, only just, but he did. So we look forwards now. First of all, to the US election. Tom is DJ today. Tom, can we have a bit of Donald Trump on the election rally?
Of course you can.
The date, remember this, November 5th, I believe it's going to be the most important date in the history of our country. I believe that.
John, you're a proud American. What's your take?
Well, it's extraordinary because I was in the United States 4 times last year, and it's as divided as ever. So I'm actually quite worried about the election. If Donald Trump does lose, I think there's a threat of kind of uprisings, and I don't want to overplay it. I also find it extraordinary because this is a business program. If you look at the state of the U.S. economy right now, U.S. is growing around 2.5%, probably hold by 1.8% next year. Under President Biden, 15 million jobs were created. We've had unemployment below 4% for the last 30 months, the first time on record. And there's an obsession with inflation, and we saw the latest Fed report at 3.3%. It's high. I think we were spoiled for the last 20 years with lower inflation. The base for Donald Trump is incredibly solid. If you look at the 5 swing states that really do call the election right now, President Biden is trailing. Instinctually, and I worked in Washington, as you know, for 5 years in politics before going into journalism again, there's a center band that's kind of being ignored right now. They don't have a major voice in the United States, and there's been a lot of legislation, 5 major bills passed by Joe Biden. I think coming out of the pandemic, the U.S. has done extremely well, but the debt levels are high, 120% of GDP, which is extraordinary. If we had that conversation 10 years ago and I said it's going to be that in 2024, you'd say, John, you're bananas. But the American public has felt the squeeze of higher food inflation, healthcare inflation, education inflation, and it's hurting him right now. And he's not as robust as he was even 5 years ago, Joe Biden. There was an interview now, and there's a big argument in Congress to release the audio of this because his memory's faulting, and the White House is resisting, for example. And that does hang over him like a cloud, even though the economic track record's very good. And, you know, Donald Trump kind of portrays America at its worst. It's not the case. It's extremely divided, and politically, I'm quite worried, and even on a security front.
That's the American election happening in November. Before that, Tom, we've got an election a couple of weeks' time, haven't we, in the UK? And you're based now in London, aren't you, John?
Yes.
Indeed, we do. And what is that, July the 4th? Interesting day to choose the UK election, isn't it? But again, you've got foots in camps on either side of the Atlantic, a long-term resident of the UK as well, spend a lot of your time there. How do you read that one as well? I mean, could Rishi Sunak be getting this any more wrong at the moment with the campaign that just seems to go from one disaster to yet another?
Well, he did take over a poison chalice, right? We've had 4 prime ministers, right, because of Brexit and Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, and you know it's been tumultuous. I don't think he has a chance at winning. Let's put it that way. The D-Day departure was absolutely ridiculous, particularly because they had that photo op with all the leaders of the world there. So it was a big miscalculation. He's not very charismatic. What I think is extraordinary right now is that when I watched the debate last week, and even in the conversations daily, even in the leading newspapers, they don't talk about Brexit. And there was a survey last night that showed that only 24% of Britain today thinks that Brexit was a good idea. It's extraordinary how much it's undermined the economy, but it's so politically sensitive that Sir Keir Starmer doesn't even want to raise it because he doesn't want to lose anybody that's, you know, was pro-Brexit. Then you have Nigel Farage coming in as the spoiler, and he's polling at like 17% in a short period of time, saying it has been a wonderful thing. Boris Johnson, I had him on a fireside chat about 6 months ago. I delivered Brexit, but I was ready with the data. There's not one indicator that said it's good for the UK economy. What is extraordinary is London, and The Economist ran a piece about a month ago talking about the regeneration of London itself. It's really popping again. The City of London real estate has picked up again. The housing prices have gone up again. It's stabilized. But as an economy, the UK is not what it was prior to Brexit. And they just don't want to deal with the elephant in the room because it's so politically sensitive.
Finally, the global economy. We've got a G7 meeting starting today in Italy, another place where you have lived and had a home.
Only one person, so no, my wife's Italian and Greek. That's the connection.
Oh, there you go. So Giorgia Meloni is the Prime Minister of Italy. She's hosting the G7 meeting in Puglia. Starts today. Let's quickly hear her take on the global economy.
Our nation has experienced an unprecedented social and economic decline, with a progressive deterioration of public finances, the quality of life of citizens, and the competitiveness of our businesses. With the left in power, the state has turned hostile to citizens and businesses, increasingly violating individual liberties.
Less than a minute, the global economy. Discuss.
Well, that's a good one. 3.2% doesn't sound too bad, but most of that growth is coming from where I used to focus at CNN in the emerging markets, right? India's power, China stabilized, Southeast Asia's growing, Africa's growing, South America's growing. But the core, if you look at the G7 economies right now, the Eurozone is growing about only 1%. I'm not expecting a lot from the G7 summit. They're going to talk about getting finance to Africa, the Middle East. President Zelensky from Ukraine is going to be there as well. Giorgia Meloni is very popular in Italy. She's not as right-wing as everybody has to say. G7, G20 really not showing anything in terms of breakthroughs right now. But I'd say after the pandemic, with inflation, the global economy is not bad. People are complaining a lot. Considering what was thrown at us for the last 5 years, Richard and Tom, I think it's pretty steady sailing. High debt levels, though, in the G7 is not encouraging.
We'll have to leave it there. John Defterios, always a pleasure. Former CNN anchor, current visiting professor of business at NYU Abu Dhabi and senior fellow at the World Economic Forum. Nice to see you.
Nice
Thanks
to
for
see you
coming
both.
in.
We'll see you next time I'm here.
Dubai Eye 103.8.
Join the conversation.